The air in the tent was not merely air. It was a thick, breathing entity, a composite of things a human being was never meant to inhale. It was made of the cloying, metallic sweetness of fresh blood and the darker, rotten fruit smell of old wounds. It was the sharp, clean sting of carbolic acid fighting a losing battle against the miasma of infection. It was the smell of unwashed, terrified bodies, of sweat-soaked wool, of the damp, churned earth that served as the floor, and underneath it all, the faint, acrid perfume of gunpowder that clung to every man dragged in from the hellscape outside. This was the air that Ayşe breathed. This was the world she now inhabited. Outside, the great Battle of Sakarya raged, a monstrous, continent-shifting struggle that would determine the fate of a nation. It was a battle of strategy, of courage, of artillery and steel. But inside the sprawling, mud-caked canvas of the field hospital, another war was being waged, a quieter but no less brutal conflict, fought for inches of life, for single heartbeats, for one more sunrise. And Nurse Ayşe, barely 20 years of age, was one of its most weary soldiers. Her world had shrunk to the flickering, golden circle of light cast by a single kerosene lamp. The lamp swung from the central tent pole, a hypnotic pendulum marking the passage of an endless night, and it turned the scenes within into a living tableau by Caravaggio, a study in stark light and profound, monstrous shadow. In its glow, she saw a boy, no older than her own brother in Istanbul, his face a pale, sweat-sheened mask, teeth chattering in the violent grip of shock. She saw a bearded veteran, a man who had likely fought in the Balkan Wars and at Gallipoli, weeping silently, not for his shattered leg, but for the wife whose name he whispered like a prayer. At this particular moment, her entire universe was focused on the mangled chest of a soldier whose name she didn't know. Her tunic, dyed the color of the Anatolian soil, was a darker shade of rust where the shrapnel had torn through. Her hands, small and once delicate, were now stained and slick, pressing down with a desperate firmness, trying to convince the torn flesh to hold on to the life that was so furiously trying to escape it. "Stay with me," she whispered, the words a raw, hoarse plea that was swallowed by the tense cacophony of groans and cries. "Breathe, please, just breathe." The soldier's eyes, clouded with the gray film of approaching death, fluttered. His lips moved, forming a wet, gurgling sound that might have been the word for mother. Ayşe felt a familiar cold dread snake its way up her spine. Her hands were fighting to close a physical wound, but she could feel a parallel tearing within her own soul, a hemorrhaging of the hope and idealism that had brought her here. She had arrived at the front believing in the sanctity of her mission, in the clean, noble power of healing. She was a healer, an angel of mercy in a white apron. But the girl who believed that was dying here on this mud floor, casualty by casualty, breath by agonizing breath. The night was far from over, and it held a horror for her that would eclipse all the others, a personal crucible that would burn away the last of the girl she had been and forge the woman she was forced to become. A few months earlier, that girl had stood in a sun-drenched square in occupied Istanbul, her heart swelling with a pure, unshakable patriotism. The city was a cage of elegant decay, its streets patrolled by foreign soldiers, but its spirit was a wildfire stoked by whispers from Anatolia, whispers of Mustafa Kemal and a new army, a new hope. She had listened to a speaker, his voice ringing with defiance, and had felt a powerful calling as clear and true as a trumpet's note. Her father, a respected and pragmatic doctor, had seen the fire in her eyes.
"This is not the world you read about in your books, Ayşe," he had told her one evening, his voice gentle but laced with a profound weariness. He held his own stethoscope in his hands, a tool that had seen him through decades of sickness and suffering in the city's pristine hospitals. In a hospital, we fight disease. Disease is logical. It has rules. War is a disease of the soul. It has no rules. You will see things that will make you question God and man and the meaning of your own work. Remember this, my daughter. You cannot carry all their pain in your heart. It is too small a vessel for such a vast ocean of sorrow. You must save who you can, and you must find a way to forgive yourself for the ones you cannot. She had smiled, the confident, unbreakable smile of youth. "I will make you proud, Father. I will save them all." The train journey to Ankara had been a slow, rhythmic stripping away of that confidence. With every mile that carried her deeper into the heartland of the resistance, the world outside her window grew harsher, the colors leaching from the landscape until it was only the muted ochre of the plains under a vast, indifferent sky. The train was packed with young men, boys who smelled of their villages and their mother's last embrace, singing boisterous anthems of valor. Ayşe watched them, their faces alight with bravado, and saw the flicker of terror in their eyes when they thought no one was looking. She was going to save them. It was a simple, declarative thought, a shield against the rising tide of her own fear. But the field hospital at the rear of the Sakarya line was not a place for simple thoughts. It shattered them. It was not a sanctuary. It was a churning engine of triage, a place where humanity was stripped down to its most basic components: pain, fear, and the will to live. The old doctor, a man whose face seemed to have been carved from granite by exhaustion, had confirmed this on her first day. Seeing her standing frozen at the entrance, her pristine medical bag in hand, he had barked at her without breaking his stride. "Don't just stand there staring, girl. This isn't a theater. There's no time for sentiment here. Only time for the next breath and the next casualty. Grab an apron. Make yourself useful, or go home." Now, weeks into the battle, that initial shock had been hammered and forged into a grim mechanical efficiency. Ayşe moved through the tent like a ghost, a blur of motion dictated by the hierarchy of need. She learned the horrifying new language of her profession, the bubbling sound of a chest wound, the sweet, sickly smell of gangrene, the stark difference between the loud, theatrical screams of a man in panic and the terrifying dead silence of one in fatal shock. Her hands learned to work independently of her heart, which she tried to lock away, a small, fragile thing she couldn't afford to let break. She found small ways to hold on. A brief connection with a young soldier from Konya who talked endlessly about his mother's famous baklava became an anchor. He was barely 17, with a soft, sparse mustache and the earnest, untroubled eyes of a boy who should have been chasing a sweetheart, not crouching in a trench. He had a shrapnel wound in his leg, painful but clean, and she had taken extra care in dressing it. "You are a hero," she had told him, forcing a smile that felt brittle on her face. "Rest now. Think of that baklava." "I will," he'd said, his own smile a flash of pure sunlight in the gloom. "When this is over, I will bring some for you and your family, nurse. I promise." These moments were dangerous. They punched small holes in the armor she was trying to build around her heart. They made the choices harder. And that night, the choices became impossible.
A fresh wave of casualties, remnants of a catastrophic charge on a fortified Greek position, flooded the tent. The stretcher-bearers, their faces blank masks of fatigue, simply deposited their burdens on any available patch of floor and ran back out into the night. It was in this fresh tide of misery that Ayşe saw him again, the boy from Konya. He was no longer smiling. His eyes were wide, but not with the light of youth. They were wide with a primal, animal terror. Another shell had found his position while he was waiting for transport. His boyish face was gray, and his hands were clutching his abdomen, where a dark, wet stain was spreading rapidly across his tunic. At the exact same moment, another stretcher was laid beside him. On it was an older veteran soldier, his leg a mangled ruin of bone and flesh, nearly severed at the thigh. He was unconscious, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He was bleeding out, fast. Ayşe's training took over. Airway, breathing, circulation. The leg wound, as horrific as it was the more immediate threat to life. Tourniquet, pressure, elevate. She was about to move to the veteran when the boy from Konya whispered her name. "Nurse Ayşe, it hurts so much. My letter to my mother. Please, you must tell her I wasn't afraid." Then the old doctor's voice cut through the chaos like a whip crack. "Ayşe, the last syringe of morphine. 1 dose. That's all we have until morning, if the supply cart even makes it through." The world stopped. The cacophony of the tent faded into a dull roar, and all Ayşe could see was the single glass syringe in the doctor's hand. 1 dose, 1 small measure of mercy. Her mind, the logical, trained part of her, presented the facts with brutal clarity. The veteran was in hemorrhagic shock. The morphine would do little to save him, but medical protocol was clear on prioritizing such catastrophic injuries. The boy's wound was internal, almost certainly fatal. The morphine could not save him either. It could only grant him a gentle, painless exit from a world of unbearable agony. Who deserved it more? The unconscious hero who might die anyway, or the conscious boy living through every second of his own horrifying death? Her father's words returned to her, a ghostly echo. "You cannot save them all. Forgive yourself." But how could she forgive this? It was a choice between her oath and her humanity. She looked at the veteran's still face, then back at the boy's terrified, pleading eyes. In his eyes, she saw her brother, her father, every boy she had ever known. She closed her own eyes, the syringe feeling as heavy as a block of stone in her hand, and made a decision that felt like a damnation. She moved toward the boy, but before she could administer the dose, The world was torn apart. The explosion was unlike any that had come before. It was not a distant rumble, but a violent physical blow. The very ground beneath them bucked like a living animal. A shockwave ripped through the tent, tearing a huge gash in the canvas and extinguishing the lamp in a puff of smoke.
Slowly, as if swimming up from a great depth, she pushed herself to her hands and knees. The ringing in her ears began to subside, replaced by the renewed, terrified screams of the wounded. Moonlight, pale and spectral, now streamed in through the gash in the tent, illuminating a scene of even greater chaos. She looked through the torn canvas, her eyes trying to make sense of the new devastation outside. An ox cart, which had been waiting to transport the less severely wounded, had been hit. It was now just a pile of splintered wood and twisted metal, its cargo of men thrown about like broken dolls. And then she saw it, a figure, lying half submerged in the mud near the wreckage, illuminated by the ghoulish light of a burning wheel. There was something horribly familiar about the way he lay. "No," she breathed, the word a small broken thing. "It cannot be." In that same instant, a sound from beside her pierced through her shock. It was not a scream or a groan. It was a soft, final sigh, a quiet, rattling exhalation of air, the sound of a life surrendering. She looked down. The old veteran soldier, the one she had decided against helping, was still. His chest was no longer moving. A horrifying ice-cold clarity washed over Ayşe, as the life she had chosen to abandon expired beside her. Her eyes were fixed on the life she would have given her own to save, lying broken and possibly dead just 50 feet away. It was Ali, her childhood friend, her neighbor from Istanbul, the boy who had carried her books from school, who had promised to wait for her. He had joined the army a month after she had left for the front. She hadn't even known he was in this sector. The cruel, perfect geometry of the tragedy was absolute. Her professional choice and its personal consequence laid bare in the moonlight. The nurse inside her had made a calculation, but the woman, the friend, the human being, was staring at an apocalypse of the heart. Something inside her broke. The careful walls she had built around her emotions, the disciplined detachment of the medical professional, it all crumbled into dust. She was no longer Nurse Ayşe. She was just Ayşe, and Ali was out there. Ignoring the doctor's frantic shouts to stay down, she scrambled through the rip in the tent and out into the churning sea of mud. The air was cold and the ground sucked at her boots, trying to pull her down. She didn't feel it. She didn't feel anything but a singular, white-hot focus. Get to him. Nothing else mattered. She fell to her knees at his side, her hands fumbling in the dark, searching for a sign. Her fingers found his neck, pressing into the cold, muddy skin. And then she felt it. A pulse. Faint, thready, a tiny, stubborn bird fluttering against the cage of his ribs. But it was there. He was alive. The realization brought not relief, but a new, sharper panic. He had a deep, gaping wound in his side, and it was bleeding sluggishly. He tore open his medical satchel, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the clasp. It was empty. She had used the last of the bandages minutes ago. She looked around wildly, as if the mud itself might offer a solution. There was nothing. Her eyes fell on her own uniform. The apron was a ruin of blood and filth, but the hem of her simple white dress beneath it, caked in mud at the very bottom, was still clean higher up. It was the last clean thing in this whole wretched world. Without a second thought, without a moment of hesitation, she bunched the fabric in her fists and ripped. The sound of the tearing cloth was shockingly loud, a violent desecration. She tore a long, wide strip from the dress she had worn on the train from Istanbul, the dress that represented the hopeful girl she had been. It was a piece of her old self, her last connection to a world of order and cleanliness.
She pressed the white fabric, this piece of her identity, into Ali's wound. She watched as the pristine white was instantly devoured by a spreading stain of deep, dark red. It was a terrible sacrament, a sacrifice of the symbol of the healer to perform the raw, desperate act of healing. She was no longer an angel in white. She was a desperate woman in the mud, fighting death with the clothes off her own back. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she got her arms under Ali's shoulders and began to drag him. He was a dead weight, and with every step the mud fought her, trying to claim them both. She fell, got up, and pulled again, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. She was fueled by nothing but a primal, animal refusal to let him go. The first hint of dawn was a cruel gray smear on the eastern horizon when she finally got him inside the relative shelter of the tent. The artillery had fallen silent, and an exhausted, unnatural peace settled over the churned-up earth. Ayşe collapsed onto a wooden crate beside the stretcher where they had laid Ali. She did not know if he would live. She had done all she could. She took his hand, her small, blood-caked fingers lacing through his cold, limp ones, and finally allowed the darkness of exhaustion to take her. She awoke to the pale light of morning. Her neck was stiff, her body a single, unified ache. Her first conscious thought was of the hand she was holding. It was warm. She looked at Ali. His eyes were closed, his face ashen, but his chest was rising and falling in a slow, shallow, but steady rhythm. The sun that morning rose on a historic Turkish victory. The Greek army was in retreat. The nation would be saved. But as Ayşe sat there in the quiet, debris-strewn tent, the grand narrative of history felt like a distant, meaningless echo. Her victory was this: the warmth of a hand, the sound of a friend still breathing. Years later, in a bright, peaceful hospital garden in the new capital of Ankara, Ayşe, now the respected matron of nursing, watched a new generation of girls in crisp, white uniforms. They were like she had once been, full of ideals, their eyes shining with the desire to heal. A man with a noticeable limp, leaning on a handsome wooden cane, approached her. The faint, silvery line of a scar traced its way from his temple to his jaw. It was Ali. He stood beside her, watching the young nurses. "You taught them well," he said, his voice quiet. I tried to teach them what's in the books, and I tried to prepare them for what is not." He was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the scar that ran across her own hand, a permanent, puckered mark
from a piece of shrapnel that night she barely remembered acquiring. "You call you a hero," he said softly. "The angel of Sakarya. But I was there. Angels belong in heaven. You walked through hell." Ayşe turned to look at him, and in his eyes he saw not a hero or an angel, but a survivor. She had never told him or anyone about the old soldier, about the choice she had made with that last syringe of morphine. It was the part of the story that belonged only to her, the heavy, secret price of Ali's life. It was the scar on her soul, the one no one could see. "No one just walks through hell, Ali," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A part of you always stays behind." And in the silence that followed, they both understood. The war had ended long ago. The nation had been built. But for those who had been in the heart of the fire, the battle never truly ended. It simply became a quieter, more personal struggle, fought every day in the silent, scarred landscapes of memory.